Last year's Call of Duty is a game that I quite frankly didn't enjoy very much. In fact, I thought it was awful. So the good news is that this one is better than that. The bad news is that it's still really not all that special. Now, Call of Duty has been trending downward for a while. I think this franchise has had some great titles. Then it began to feel relatively uninspired and mediocre, and in recent years, I think we've gotten some Call of Duties that fail to reach even that subpar threshold, and were actually just shitty, soulless games. Well, one issue I think many people pointed to, especially concerning Infinite Warfare, was its futuristic setting and the change of gameplay that came with it. People were tired of it. And while it's not the only thing that was wrong, I wholeheartedly agree that it was a factor. So many people, myself included, were pretty excited to find out that COD was going to make its triumphant return back to World War II and usher in with it that sweet, sweet boots-on-the-ground gameplay that everyone fell in love with all those years ago. Well, unfortunately, simply returning to boots-on-the-ground does not guarantee a return to the glory days of really good COD games. Instead, it's been a return to mediocre ones. It is the embodiment of mediocrity. Most of the time it is a sound, competent shooter, but it never achieves anything close to greatness across any of its offered modes. But to start with the positive, the gameplay is solid. Boots on the Ground does make its triumphant return after a few years of enhanced mobility shooters, and in my opinion is 100% the right direction for the series going forward. This gameplay formula is an incredibly strong foundation, and I'm happy to see it come back. It feels good, the controls are tight and responsive. This is, in my opinion, what Call of Duty should play like. Here's the issue. Like I said, going back to your roots doesn't automatically make your game good. You still have to build compelling content around that formula. Call of Duty World War II doesn't do that. Let's briefly go over the campaign. Now, the amount of impact this story will have on you is completely dependent on if you've ever seen any World War II movie before. It really feels like they just hit every cliche in the book when it comes to character development, and while I don't think anyone does a bad job as far as the actors are concerned, it just feels like they're doing a job someone else has already done before. Before going into this story, I want you to make a list of every World War II or war movie cliche you can think of, and at the end of the game, tell me if you have even a single box that isn't checked off. You play as Red, aka Joe Schmo. You have a wife back at home and a baby on the way, so if you happen to die, that'd be really sad. Your sergeant is an asshole, but he's only that way because of a tragic backstory where the last time he cared, it got his men hurt. I give you more examples, but on the off chance you are completely clueless to all these cliches, I'll let you figure them out for yourself. Honestly, I feel like Saving Private Ryan needs a spoiler warning now on Call of Duty's behalf. Again, it's just passable. I feel like there were efforts made. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but if you were to tell me, hey, I think I'm just going to skip the campaign, I wouldn't feel compelled to change your mind, not just because the story is uninspired, but the gameplay scenarios are as well, and that's so disappointing. You bring back the gameplay, but then you use the exact same setups you've used multiple times before. Like clockwork, this game takes you from infantry section to stealth mission, to driving set piece, to sniper mission, to on-rail turret sequence, and while none of those things are objectively bad, in fact, in a vacuum, any of them could be quite fun, they are all things we have done before in Call of Duty games. And here's where it becomes a real issue. I could still understand a Call of Duty doing these things, even though none of them are new. The problem is they use them over and over and over again and just cycle from one to another. It's like, oh, here's a sniping sequence, and here's another one, and another one. Oh, here's another stealth section, and another one. It's so mechanical in its presentation of gameplay ideas that it almost breaks the illusion of the game itself. Your boots on the ground gameplay is only as good as the scenarios that you put it in. So if your entire game is compiled of set pieces players have already done before, and then you repeat those same things even more times, that's not going to be very exciting. I'd say there's only 2, maybe 3 sections throughout the whole campaign that really mix things up and do something new, and I really think it needed a few more. It's disappointing because we got the gameplay back, but we weren't given any new types of missions or scenarios or ideas to utilize it, and the end result is just kind of average. And that leads into the multiplayer. Now, the majority of my complaints carry over from my first impressions video with a few new ones showing up, and really I think we need to start with the map design. The map selection in this game ranges from average to just plain bad. I wouldn't say there's even really one map that stands out for a good reason. A few that stand out for bad ones, though. And ultimately, there's just not a lot of them either. This game is only shipping with 9 maps, with an extra you get for pre-ordering or some shit, and then another 3 maps that are exclusive to the new war mode. But really, speaking of the bread and butter of COD, 9 maps is simply not good enough, and to have the audacity of withholding a map in a game that is already light in that department, it's moronic. As a package, it just isn't a very good selection. For the most part, these maps use the same old 3-lane design, which in and of itself, I believe, is way overused, but even as 3-lane maps go, these ones have issues. I've noticed a lot of them, rather than funneling action throughout the lanes, they are dominated by singular power positions, for instance, the center building in St. Marie-du-Mont. And some lanes receive little to no action at all, like the side lanes with the caves on Gibraltar. Some maps like Aachen funnel the map through the middle and yet have huge spawn areas that feel completely unnecessary and counterintuitive to how the map naturally flows and funnels players. It's really strange. A lot of these maps just feel off. Now, they're not all bad. There's a handful I'd say I enjoy, and there's even a couple I'd say stray away from the 3-lane design a bit, but I wouldn't necessarily say those maps are all that great either. They're just different, which in a way I can appreciate. But to keep myself on topic, I've elected to save some of my more detailed thoughts on the map selection for its own video. Overall, a very small, average at best selection of maps here. But that's also not COD World War II's only problem. The loadout system appears to have actually regressed from previous entries. You'd think a traditional COD game would want to expand something like its create a class system, as it is again one of those great avenues of introducing new ideas, but really here, they're only pretending to do something new. Now, we have divisions and basic training and all these things they try to pass off as new, but when you really think about it, it's just the same old stuff we've had before, only rebranded and reorganized a bit in a way that ultimately gives you less options. They've essentially just taken all of the perks and abilities and grouped them together via the divisions of basic training I mentioned. For instance, the airborne class can put silencers on their gun and run longer distances. How innovative. I remember a time where silencers were an attachment and we had perks like marathon that let you run more. The sniper class has this really unique ability where you can hold your breath and reduce the sway of your gun. Yet I recall that being a default ability in COD's past. They've really added almost nothing here. They've just taken all of the options you've already had and gated them off in a way to try and make it seem like you have more choices, and the basic trainings are 100% glorified perks that you only get one of. They have made creating a class somehow more confusing, while at the same time giving you less stuff. It's actually pretty impressive when you look at it that way. One of my favorite aspects of COD was mixing and matching various perks and weapons and gear to find setups that are really enjoyable. And COD World War II has taken a step back from great to average in that department. And if they did it for balancing reasons, they wanted a more focused experience, then that might have been alright if they made up for the depth that has been lost. But they haven't. This multiplayer component feels like less of what we've already had in this franchise. And on top of that, I wouldn't even call this a polished offering. I wouldn't say weapon balance is all that great, though admittedly, I find a few very satisfying and fun to use, but things like hit detection feel really spotty sometimes, and those bullshit moments seem to be way more frequent than you'd like them to be. On top of some horrific connection issues that started with a disastrous launch day and has some lingering problems since then. It all culminates in a multiplayer offering that just feels mediocre. It's not that the game is horrid, it's just not special, and for a franchise that has such a large community, we should be expecting more and getting more. It's got an emaciated map selection, a create a class system lacking the depth of past entries, and it has inconsistent performance. And on top of that, no new interesting game modes for the traditional multiplayer component outside of the new war mode, which we'll talk about next. If you watched my earlier video, you may recall me pointing out that war mode isn't nearly the big, large-scale warfare mode it's been marketed to be. Instead, it plays out like a series of micro-encounters designed around specific objectives. It's really more like 3 to 4 really small maps focused on accomplishing one thing that are connected to each other than it feels like one big map. And I have to say, there's some fun to be had here. I like scenario encounter-based designs focused on specific objectives, and these maps have that. But these mini encounters are so focused and streamlined that there really isn't a lot of variety in how you play them. It feels like tug of war. The areas are small, there's an ungodly amount of grenade spam on objectives just because the chance to get random grenade kills feels so high, and it is. The scenarios just don't take that long to figure out. Now, this isn't inherently bad. Like I said, I actually enjoy the mode, and if you want to hear more detailed thoughts on it, I say a lot more in that other video. But the bottom line is, it isn't the next big thing maybe you thought it was. It isn't the large-scale COD mode you maybe were hoping for, and if I'm just being honest, I don't know if it could be any smaller or more focused and intimate. And on top of that, it only has 3 maps, so the longevity of the mode I think is in danger, quite frankly. And finally, this relatively bland multiplayer experience is wrapped up and connected to the social space called Headquarters. Ultimately, this is just an interactive user interface with a few fun little side activities to do in between games. There's a firing range, there's a little arena to 1v1 your friends, but I'm just going to be honest. This and the entire user interface is an absolute disaster. This is some of the worst UI I've seen in a AAA game. It is confusing, it is cumbersome, clunky, it's horrible. Everything from the main menus to the individual tabs feel like a discombobulated mess. Again, a whole video's worth of stuff to talk about just concerning the game's horrible UI. And speaking of horrible things, this game, of course, has loot boxes, which as of this moment can be purchased via a fake currency that can be bought with real money. Admittedly, it feels far less egregious and ingrained into the experience as the similar system found in Infinite Warfare, but these systems are never good, and Activision has found new ways to make them suck. For instance, you open loot boxes in front of other players now, and there are even challenges that encourage you to watch other people get their free shit. This just seems gross. They've basically implemented a system that advertises their loot boxes and tries to encourage its players to buy them, and of course loot boxes themselves are filled with a bunch of garbage like grip camos to hide the stuff you really want. And while it's already an annoying thing to have in your game, there are signs that this system is going to actually get worse and implement more gameplay altering items in the future, so be cautious of that happening as well. There are countless little things I could nitpick on and drone on for another 15 minutes, but I think it'd be best if I just talked about zombies and call it a day. In my opinion, this is one of the better non-Treyarch zombie offerings. You can tell a lot of effort went into it, and the team clearly had a passion to make this mode something exceptional, and I think in a lot of ways they did that. There's a lot of cool ideas here, including special boss zombies, new perks. It has a very elaborate map. I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable saying it does anything inherently wrong, but I do have a few comments I'd like to make that you may like about it, or you may dislike, depending on your preference. It's pretty subjective. There seems to be an emphasis on horror here. They've gone with a really dark, moody atmosphere and have implemented jump scares and spooky sound cues, and this makes sense considering Sledgehammer has ties to the Dead Space franchise. There's some people who have worked on both games working there, so they wanted to make it more scary, and I think the art direction is great. I certainly don't mind the darker tone, and the jump scares don't necessarily detract from the experience, but in my opinion, it kind of clashes with what Zombies is, a wave-based survival mode. Horror requires a setup, and is best suited for scripted, controlled encounters, which is completely contradictory to wave-based survival modes that are designed to be played over and over and over again. So that kind of makes the jump scares not really scary at all, and they just kind of become repetitive, and some of the things they try to do to scare you may grow tiresome as you continue to play the mode. In addition to that, it feels like they focus more on run and gun rather than holding out, which I think is a preference. For me, I prefer holding out, trying to keep barricades built, funneling zombies through tight corridors, just trying to hold them off as long as possible. To me, that's the style I prefer. But this doesn't do that, and who knows, maybe you prefer that. There's no barricades to build. Zombies can pop out of almost anywhere, so you need to be constantly moving, and you also have the choice between classes, which gives you various abilities and whatnot. I don't care much for the class system, but could hardly call it a negative. Really, the only true negative here is, once again, the inclusion of loot boxes. Cod WWII actually has two separate loot box systems, one for multiplayer stuff and one for zombies, and the zombie stuff seems far more gameplay altering and pay to winish. Now, it's not as disastrous as pay to win in competitive modes, but quite frankly, I don't like it in cooperative modes either. It's a dangerous trend I'm seeing where companies are taking their established survival modes and filling them with gameplay altering microtransactions because they're so easy to monetize and can get away with it under the guise that you're not fighting other players, but I still think it damages the integrity and enjoyment of the mode, and it once again does here. And that's basically Call of Duty WW2 in a nutshell. A game I would ultimately consider to be a return to mediocrity for the series. And if you listen to my review, you may think that mediocre is too generous, and in some respects that may be the case. But at the end of the day, I do not think this is a terrible game. It's just an uninspired one. The core of COD is strong, and that's still here. But rather than introduce interesting ideas and opportunities around that core, COD WWII is content to just give you the bare minimum, and in some instances, less than COD has given you before. The choice to pick this game up ultimately lies with you, and I hope this video has been a benefit, whether it be to help you make that decision, or just in terms of giving you some form of entertainment. I don't believe this is a game that deserves to be shunned. If you opened it as a gift during the holidays, I don't think you need to throw it at the person who bought it for you, and you might have a bit of fun, which I have had. But there's nothing here that is going to blow you away, and overall, the game is average at best. And I'm starting to wonder if Call of Duty is even capable anymore of being better than that. Till next time.